Good, I'll introduce you.
Please do.
My pleasure.
One more moment.
They were good readings, right?
Yep. Excellent.
Huh? Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Good.
Okay. So, Elizabeth Allison is our speaker today, and it really is a pleasure, since we're not just colleagues, we're friends, and have been for 5 years. There was once upon a time, Elizabeth was in Bhutan,
Yes.
and not in the castle. You were out somewhere ecologically located, and I had been chair of a committee looking for a person to be the 5th person in our department who would bring ecology, and having been properly educated in ecology. And we interviewed 6 or 7 people, none of whom was correct for whatever reason. And then Brian and I had a conversation with our mutual friend Mary Evelyn Tucker, who said, "Oh, I know who you want. You want Elizabeth Allison." I said, "Okay, great, we'll hire her tomorrow." And this is like when I was growing up, people used to be a big deal. I got my job through the New York Times. Well, anybody who gets a job through Mary Evelyn Tucker, that's the right thing to do. But what's her name was in Bhutan, and we had to wait for 9 months to get an interview, so we very ineptly hooked up a pretend Skype, which went on and off and on and off, and then we had a phone interview or whatever else, but she already had the job, really.
You didn't tell
And
me
then we
that.
waited, then she had, her mentor wouldn't let her come, because she had to jot every little I of her dissertation, which actually was good for her, good for us. Seemed like a long time to wait, but it's a good idea actually to do it right. And then Elizabeth came and started to teach ecology, religion and ecology, some more social science than we ever had, and has been a great colleague and a good friend. And so now we have in our not quite in our department, I'll explain that, but it's might as well be, because all of the faculty in ecology, spirituality, religion are PCC faculty. So it's a whole weird thing. So we're trying to figure out whether to do something new or not, and if it takes off. You can't just do something, you have to make sure it's met, then it has to make a loop, right? So we're looking for the response, for the echo to come back. Great idea, or okay, we'll see. A little bit, you already have the idea that we really were looking and found her, and now she's here, and it's all great. The program that Elizabeth has created inside of this large sort of marquee called PAR, all right, is something that Elizabeth and I and some other people really passionately believe should be here. Exactly where it should be or how it should be, not so important maybe. It's a subsequent question. The primary question is to get in the door the relationship of ecology and major religious traditions. And when Mary Evelyn, who is at Yale with her husband John Grimm, is asked why she's doing this religion and ecology, she always says, because that's where the people are. And that's true. A lot of people, like 3/4 of the globe, is organizable under one of those headings. So if we want to change the thinking of humanity in an organized and effective way, then religion is surely one of the best ways to do it, and probably could lead politics, right? Since actually they're both a little behind the curve, a little behind our curve, but these are the two engines along with corporations, which could turn out to be ahead. Wouldn't that be interesting? Maybe not. But if they decide, the latest report that I read says it is profitable.
What's profitable?
Green.
What is it?
Great, the latest report was along, anyway. The two reports said the same thing.
Which one? Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'd have to get the exact name.
Mhm.
Anyway, I assume that my colleagues are interested in this no more than I do, so I don't bring them information, because they always have it already, having read it on some website in the middle of the night. So, in Thomas Berry's book, The Great Work, there are really 4 critiques. The academy, or the organized religion, corporations, and governments. All right, and I don't know which of the 4 will lead the way or which will hold back the worst. But I'm happy to say that Elizabeth knows actually quite a lot about all 4 of them, but the one that she's specializing in academically is religion and ecology and religion. So she can say more about the program if she chooses. If not, we'll just hear what she has to tell us. I just want to remind you that this course has each of the 5 of us coming in and doing what we're about. So that if you were to look ahead to courses that we would be teaching, you would already have some idea of our perspective, strengths, weaknesses, style, personality, and yeah, some other things too. So as a result of this time together, you have some idea not only of courses that Elizabeth teaches and will teach, but also the program that she heads, ecology, spirituality, and religion. Maybe you'll talk about the 3 words?
I will.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then I won't.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's no fun to have somebody introduce you and take everything that you were going to say. So, warm welcome to Elizabeth. Thank you. I know you just talked for 2 hours and 53 minutes. And I hope you have a power bar and caught your breath. And
Thanks for that lengthy.
Yes, yes, yes.
That was great. You might want to mention my degrees, my awards,
I could
where
go.
was born.
I love Elizabeth's degrees. I love Elizabeth's degrees. Elizabeth did religion and ecology at Williams, and those of us who are East Coast people pay attention to schools like that. Williams and Amherst. I just read this morning a long review last night in the New York Review of Books about his name's Derizowitz. Looks like the guy who's just written Sheep, something Sheep.
Oh, Excellent Sheep or something like that.
Excellent, is it?
I think it's Excellent Sheep.
Excellent Sheep, yeah. This was my 3rd review of it. It might or might not be relevant that he didn't get tenure at Yale, but anyway, it's a rather crabby book about the privilege of people who go to, he mentioned Harvard, Yale, Princeton. I always go Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown. And he's particularly singled out Amherst and Williams as being, accusing all of the students there of being white, privileged, and unthinking, which I thought was not likely from what I know. So I went to Amherst, and they seem to be pretty thoughtful people. So it's an interesting question about this whole thing of prestige and whatever else. But what I am sure about is that at Williams, Elizabeth got a terrific education, and then she did both religion and ecology at Yale, and that was before John and Mary Evelyn came, though.
Yeah, it was.
Though Mary Evelyn was the 4th reader of her dissertation, along with Carolyn Merchant and Louise, who I'm still not met. Well, I meet her before, she'll probably retire before I
She
ever
is
meet her.
retired.
She is retired. Bless her. Anyway, Carolyn Merchant, whose name you surely all know, author of The Death of Nature. And then at Berkeley in ecology and a lot of social science, I'm happy to say, because we do, but we need a little bit of whatever this means. You know what it means. Whatever words go with it. So that's really great. And especially from what I hear, I think it's true that Elizabeth's signature course, or one of her signature courses, is contested knowledges. Do you think of that as, yeah?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's very highly, come highly recommended to my ear. Anecdotes are not scientific, you know, but they're not useless either, especially if you know who you're listening to. So that, of course, goes, which, etc. So Elizabeth, no doubt, now has caught her breath, because I know she can just run from, she has a
Sure.
3.5 year old?
2.5.
2.5.
2.5.
She's pretty smart for 2.5.
She is, actually.
She's very smart. And tall.
She's
For
very
2.5.
tall, yes.
Tall and smart for 2.5. So if you can do that, I think anybody who can keep up with 2.5 can do anything. By now you've undoubtedly caught your breath.
Yes,
Okay.
now I'm already rearranging my talk based on what you said. so.
Oh no, stay with it. Okay. Elizabeth Allison, thank you.
Thank you so much for
Okay,
that
it's a pleasure.
lovely, long introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here, and I saw, I think, most of you on that first day when we had the orientation to PCC, but I think we haven't seen each other since, other than Lily with whom I just spent 3 hours. So it's good to see you and get a sense of who you are, and hopefully I'll see more of you next semester and Excellent and in our events throughout the year. So I think the very first thing I should say is a little something about my 2 hats that I'm wearing right now, at least 2, but 2 that are relevant for you. So I'm a core faculty member in PCC. I was hired into PCC 5 years ago. Go to PCC faculty meetings. I teach PCC courses. Robert and I are going to teach the integrative seminar together in the spring, and probably next spring too, I hope. And so when you're about to graduate, you'll be taking the integrative seminar. And I also wear another hat as director of the concentration in ecology, spirituality, and religion. And so I don't know if that might be confusing, but those are very synchronous hats that I wear, because the courses that I have taught in PCC historically and the new courses that I'm creating for ESR are relevant to PCC, and the courses that I've taught in PCC are relevant to ESR, because my interest is in religions and worldviews and how they influence what we do with ecology. And a really pithy summary of that is from your Lynn White article, where he says, what we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the man-nature relationship. I would change that to human-nature relationship, but he was writing more than 40 years ago. More science, more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecologic crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. And to me, those have been my marching orders for like 20 years, except I didn't even read that article 20 years ago. But in college, I wanted to know, how does what we think about nature influence what we do in nature? And no one was really studying it at that time. Although I did manage to do religion and environmental studies in college, even though there wasn't really support for it at that time. And then I was working professionally for a while in nonprofit organizations, and eventually the time ripened. And I was able to pursue graduate studies in religion and ecology. The field was getting going, and I was able to pursue it right up to here. And so now, 2 years ago, we started the concentration in ecology, spirituality, and religion here at CIS. And as I have said, it's very much of a sister program to PCC. Our courses are interwoven, our faculty are interwoven, but the focus is slightly different. And the focus is really at looking at religions and spiritualities. And PCC, I think, takes a much broader view of worldviews overall and cosmology overall. In ESL, we're focusing down just a little bit. Religion is still pretty broad and spirituality is still pretty broad, but it's a little more of a focus towards how do these 2 areas, religion and spirituality and ecology, relate to each other. And so is that sort of clear, those dual roles? Okay, because I don't want you to think, oh, she's not really in PCC, or I don't know, I am. And I'm very happy to be as such. And also so thrilled about the new concentration, because it's something that I was looking for as a college student and then as an early graduate student, and now it finally exists. And so I'm hoping that those people who would be looking for such a similar thing would find their way here. And thrilled to know that tonight when we have our information session, there's going to be 5 prospective students attending. So yeah, and so I hope that the ESR program will develop alongside PCC and develop the same sort of wonderful, inclusive, exciting, collaborative, innovative, creative community that PCC has. Let's see. So what I want to do today is talk to you about the field of religion and ecology, where I locate my work, talk to you about its history and development and some of its methods, and talk about a little bit more about how it lives here at CIS and in PCC. And then I want to, and certainly I want to discuss the readings and any questions or comments you may have. And then I want to, if we can, try to apply what I've discussed and what you've read and other things that you've learned so far this semester to some current crises. And I have to tell you, I have been obsessed with the Ebola crisis. Is anyone else following this? Okay, so we have some knowledge in the room. And then for those of you who haven't, we'll talk about it. But that and the biodiversity crisis, I think, are fascinatingly interlinked. And I think that there is a fascinating, there's room to apply the tools of religion and ecology to this issue. And I've been thinking about it a lot. I don't have it quite all worked out, but I want to work it out together. And I think that would be an interesting application of some of the concepts of religion and ecology that I'm going to talk about. So that's my agenda here. Let me share with you this timeline of some key moments in the field of religion and ecology so you can get a sense of the historical trajectory. And I will talk you through those. Actually, while that's going around, let me point out that religion and ecology as a field has been around only for about 20 years, and I'll talk about some of the initiating occasions that gave rise to it. But even in that 20 years, it's developed a plethora of perspectives and approaches and views on the field. And so a few years ago, 2 of the leaders in the field, Chris Chappell, who teaches down in Southern California at Loyola Marymount and is a good friend of CIS, and Willis Jenkins, who teaches at Virginia now, they wrote a review article surveying the field of religion and ecology, and they identified 3 areas that they thought were being referred to when people talked about religion and ecology. They said you could really group the efforts into 3 areas, and then I'm going to add two more after that. So they identified environmental actions by religious leaders, either the actual actions or the study of such actions. And they identified this approach as being most closely associated with Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm. And as Robert said, Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm are arguably the founders of this field, and I'll go back and trace that history in a few moments. They are now based at Yale. They're very good friends of Robert's and also of Brian Swim's. Brian and Mary Evelyn Tucker collaborated on the film The Journey of the Universe. So they're really part of our extended PCC family and network.
Are they married?
And they're married. They're a husband and wife team. Yeah.
And I taught religion and ecology here.
Yes. When?
4 or 5 years ago, just before they went to Yale.
Okay, yeah. They went in, it's on your timeline actually, 2006 or so? So.
Sounds longer, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So they have been very invested in studying the environmental actions of religious leaders, and also the analysis of texts, religious texts, looking for environmental messages or practices. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So that's one approach. Another approach is political environmentalism, or what you could call secular environmentalism. That appeals to religious texts and practices for normative judgments and inspiration, or they said bolstered by religious resources. So it could be, say, these climate activists marching, but then they're looking to religious texts or sources for their moral authority and their inspiration. And the study of this approach has been most associated with Roger Gottlieb. Who's at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and is a prolific writer on many things, on progressive politics, and gender, and religion and ecology. But he has a very strong political angle on environmental issues, and then brings in the religion as sort of moral authority. And we almost got him here a few years ago, and then we didn't. Yeah.
He often writes for the New Yorker, long, excellent articles.
Yeah. I didn't know that, actually. He's prolific. He's written like 30 books or something. He's very prolific. This Sacred Earth is one of them that's quite well known. And then the third approach that Chaplin and Jenkins identified is the environmental movement. The environmental movement or environmental practices interpreted as a religious movement or as religious practices. So some of the new studies in this area interpret fly fishing or surfing or homesteading as religious practices. Practices that might at first blush look just like nature activities, and then the scholars who study those practices say actually these bear some semblance to religious practices. They have a code of ethics, they have a higher authority, they have various aspects of religious practices, and so we're actually going to understand them through the lens of religious studies as religious practices. And this approach has been most associated with Ron Taylor, who's at the University of Florida and directs another doctoral program it's called Religion and Nature there. He's also the editor of the Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature, which is a really comprehensive volume that looks at all the ways, not all the ways, but so many ways that religions and environmentalisms and ecologies and natures come into conversation with each other. So you can see that these are three quite different approaches that have already arisen in the field in just a couple decades. And then there's, even more recently, there are a couple more, which are, scary this, well, religious ecologies, a new phrase that Tucker and Grimm have coined in their most recent book. This pen's not great. So their most recent book is Ecology and Religion, came out 2 years ago, I think. And they wrote it for an environmental press, for Island Press. And so they focus on the ecology more than the religion. And they focus on both of them together, but they sort of highlight the ecology. And they coined the term religious ecologies to talk about the ways that religions engage with the non-human environment in their practice of religion. So whether they have outdoor rituals or I'm trying to think of some examples from the book. They're mostly outdoor rituals, actually. Or whether they bring elements of nature into their church or temple or other religious building for some kind of ritual, or whether they involve animals in their ritual. These are different ways of engaging with ecology through religion. And so they call these religious ecologies. And they say that in the religions that they've surveyed, world religious traditions, they find that every religion has religious ecologies, and that we need to understand these more and better to understand more about the human-nature relationship. And then, even more recently, spiritual ecology. More recently and not recently. So it turns out that there are at least 4 books entitled Spiritual Ecology. One of them came out in the 80s. I think landed like lead. As far as, I mean, I've never seen it. I only found it on Amazon. It didn't appear to ever have been read or reviewed or anything like that. One that came out in the 90s that did appear to have been read some. And then 2 that came out 2 years ago, which is really interesting. Or 2 years ago? Did I write that in here? One that came out last year and one that came out the year before. So in 2012, Les Sponsel, who was an anthropologist at the University of Hawaii and is now retired, published a book called Spiritual Ecology, A Quiet Revolution. And he had a whole track at the University of Hawaii in the anthropology department in spiritual ecology until he retired. It appears that they haven't found anyone to take that over as yet. And he defines spiritual ecology as a complex, diverse, and dynamic arena at the interfaces of religions and spiritualities on the one hand, and on the other, environments, ecologies, and environmentalisms with intellectual, spiritual, and practical components. Then, so that was 2012. And then, in 2013, Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, who is a friend of CIS and PCC, and particularly Brian Swim, and who lives up in, I think, Marin, or north of here, he published a book called Spiritual Ecology, also, Spiritual Ecology, The Cry of the Earth. And he defines spiritual ecology as the exploration of the spiritual dimension of our present ecological crisis. In particular, these resources explore the interrelationship between our outer physical ecological situation, our awareness of the sacred in creation, and our interrelation to the symbolic world of the soul, and how this affects our own soul and the soul of the world, the animal. So it's a bit more, it's a bit more soulful, because he says that like three times. But it's a bit more soulful explanation, and this one's a bit more anthropological, as befitting his position. So I think that our timing, our program, timing the introduction of ESR, as these spiritual ecology approaches were being articulated and coming to the fore, was very synchronicitous, and probably influenced by currents that were around. But so you can see that from these 5 approaches to religion and ecology, we've got the focus on religious leaders, we've got the focus on political aspects of environmentalism, we've got the focus on nature practices, and then ecological engagements of religions, and then a couple definitions of spiritual ecology. So it's a range of approaches and identifications in the field, but all trying to look at the way worldviews, religion, spirituality influence and shape the way that people deal with the natural environment. And so, as I said, I think it was fortuitous that we called our program ESR rather than just ecology and religion or ecology and world religions, which were some other ideas that we talked about. Because the spiritual aspect seems to resonate with people a lot and seems to allow for a broader sense of the sacred, of the soul aspect, of the interconnections between humans and nature that might not be captured exactly in mainstream religions or what people understand as our dominant religions, although those are starting to change. So that's a series of approaches in the field. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
I'm wondering where the shamanic and the entheogenic fits in.
Yeah, I suspect, well, the shamanic traditions certainly have a long, long history, and I think that Sponsel studied those somewhat. And those could also be, yeah, that's probably actually the best place. Shamanic traditions haven't probably been studied as much in this category because of a dearth of written texts. I mean, it's much more practice-based. And that was one of the things I was going to point out in a few minutes is some of the new directions in religion and ecology, and there's much more attention to practice, whether it's in a shamanic tradition or even in a mainstream religious tradition, looking at how people live their religion and not only looking at texts. That's a good point. And entheogen probably here as well. Robert?
And the first one, environmental actions by religious leaders, and Mary Ellen and John, I would have thought they were not the authors of the 10 volumes. I would have thought were, when I recall, mostly academics and not so many religious leaders.
So studying the, sorry, that's not here. So these are all studying the? Does that help? No. Okay. These are approaches. Studying. So what Chappell and Jenkins proposed was that one approach is studying the environmental actions of religious leaders, which I think they would say includes texts by or religious leaders, broadly understood.
Okay.
So these are not the practices, but these are the ways of studying.
Thank you.
Thanks for that clarification. So this would be studying the political environmentalism bolstered by religious resources. And this would be studying the environmental movement or studying nature practices as interpreted as religious practices. There was another hand somewhere.
If someone asked you, how do you define religion, what would you say?
I wouldn't say anything.
But is it the implication that it's somehow institutionalized?
So right, that's and religion is notoriously difficult to define. In my second year of college, I took a class called Religion 101, and the final paper, the assignment was define religion, and it was feared throughout the campus because no one ever did well on it because it was impossible. But I passed the class anyway. But I think, yeah, that you point to an important distinction between religions and spiritualities, and at least in sort of general conversation, religion is usually associated with the mainstream dogmatic world religions, right? That have a long history, a textual tradition. Many of them have designated leaders and prophets, authorities, buildings, houses of worship, and then again in the sort of common parlance, spirituality tends to be associated with private internal understanding or practice, and spirituality is much more associated with practice, I think. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be that way because certainly mainstream religions have lots of ritual, which is practice, but in the studies oftentimes it looks like spirituality is associated more with embodied practices, embodiment, personal, loosely structured or unstructured groups of worshipers. But I could actually turn that question back to you guys. Do you have a...
I just happen to have written about this, so
Okay, great,
I'm willing
please.
to offer it for
Yeah.
consideration. That it seems to me all the religious traditions, the biggies, have the three jewels of Buddhism:
Yep,
the teacher, the Dharma, the Sangha. And the Dharma, I think, has two parts. That's not ER, but A, with my unfortunate accent. Teacher, Dharma, and Sangha.
yeah,
And the Dharma refers to both teaching and practice. And for better or worse, I think that spirituality really only does half of Dharma, doesn't do teacher, and doesn't do Sangha. And the worst part is that it has no Sangha, and therefore nobody can find people who do spiritual. Spiritual people don't get feedback. There's no community to help us when we're floundering. So even though religion in this school has a really bad reputation, I believe that it is extremely positive for the first and third jewel.
thank you. I was actually thinking of that, probably influenced by what you said in my class a few weeks ago, similar, as an argument for religion and ecology, and why we need to involve religions and the study of religion in addressing environmental issues, but also maybe why we need religion ourselves, however we would define that. And I think I may have more to say about that when we try to apply all this to our case study. But it seems to me that the teachings and the collective are extremely important, especially, I mean, and you have to have the teacher to have the teachings, but especially at this particular moment in world history.
Are we willing to change collective to community?
Absolutely. I've somehow understood Sangha to be translated as collective. And I can't tell you from where I've understood that.
Doesn't seem so to me.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I mean, it came initially from Theravada Buddhism, where
Yeah.
it's monks, but it's not a collective. It's
Yeah,
a community. They live together, they chant together, they light candles together,
yeah,
bake together.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have to think about more about why.
I was just reminded of it. I was at a conference this weekend of, I was giving a keynote of an annual meeting of the Anthroposophical Society, and I saw a lot of people I hadn't seen in 20 years. And it just crashed in on me how close those people feel to me, and I felt to them even though I hadn't seen them in 20 years. It was community,
Yeah,
because we have
Yeah.
ideals in common and
Yeah.
practices in common.
okay.
And that's what you don't get when you're sitting in your zafu at home.
That's right. I'm absolutely convinced.
He said pointedly.
Yes, clearly. Well, or, just a personal example, I used to practice yoga a lot at home, which is great, and you can get a lot of internal benefit as well as external benefit, but the benefit is just so much greater in practicing with a Sangha, so that's a bit more, new age or something.
Then we agree to that, Elizabeth. I'm enjoying our agreement.
Yeah, of course.
And
Of course. Were there other questions or comments about these approaches to religion and ecology?
Well,
Yeah.
just a comment on Sangha.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the danger of Sangha is that it becomes a social thing.
Yes.
Like people go to church and they just socialize and they don't focus on the teachings at all. I mean, I just need to voice that out because that's a
Sure.
big thing in religion.
That's been a big critique of mainstream religion for decades. I'm not sure, I personally used to be very much more critical on exactly that account, and now I'm not sure that it matters at all. I think if people go and join a collective, this time I'm gonna say collective, but go and socialize around some kind of positive central goal. I mean, they're not planting drug dealing or committing murders or something for the most part, as far as I know, but it's around some kind of positive goal of building community and sharing inspiration and maybe praising a certain God or maybe not for some people. But I think that that people need community, and it's very hard to find in the modern age. And so if that works, then great. And I don't think it even has to go to the teachings or the teacher if that's not suitable for a certain individual. I mean, I think that I agree with Robert that there's greater richness if it does, and probably greater benefit over time, but if that's not suitable for whatever reason, then so be it. That said, I don't go to church, so you know, do what you will with that. And yet I want my daughter to. So I don't know, you know, really where we can go with that. It's complex, right? It's complicated. But yeah, keep these. I want to return to the triple gem because I think all three of those ideas are really essential for tackling our most pressing current issues. And that's what religion and ecology endeavors to do. It's a field with a normative or moral mission. It doesn't just say that we're collecting data that we're disinterested in or that we just want to know for the sake of knowing. It says there's a greater good that we're trying to pursue. There's a normative goal here, and it matters. And to me, that's such a nice field to work in. I mean, that you feel that even your scholarly work, even your analysis of texts or practices or people could have an impact on the world. And not everyone in academia agrees with that. Some people don't like applied work. They say that it distracts you from the goal of pure knowledge and that you should just seek pure knowledge. Yeah, which I don't think exists. So I want to return to then how we might apply this to pressing problems. But before we do that, when do you take a break in here?
We do take a break.
Yeah, what time?
And we have tea and we have strawberry cookies that we share with you.
Wow, this is fantastic. I'll come every week. But at what time?
I think about 20 after,
Okay.
25 after, anything in there between 15 and 30.
Sounds good. Then I'll carry on for a few moments. All right. Pages are recording. Okay, so I did want to mention some, 2, 3, 4. Okay, great. I wanted to mention some methods, and then I want to mention some cutting edges or some growing edges in this field. And the methods actually fall into these breakdown along this line. So as Lin White Jr. said in the article that you read, he said the only way forward is to reimagine our old religion or begin anew. And basically the methods fall into those two broad categories. So Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm and people who evaluate texts have been associated with retrieval, re-evaluation, so they've engaged in a method. People who study texts of any of the world's religions have been engaged in a method of trying to retrieve texts that might not have been given sufficient attention, that may have ecological themes or teachings about the human-nature relationship, re-evaluating texts that may have may promote a damaging attitude toward non-human nature or may promote an attitude of wanton use or destruction, and then reconstructing or reinterpreting commonly used texts in a more ecological light. So this involves bringing to these texts a particular interpretive lens, right? It's not necessarily an objective lens. It doesn't say I'm just trying to seek the original knowledge of what the writers meant, but it's trying to bring religious texts into the modern conversation to address current issues and current problems. And so it's bringing an awareness of, for example, the damage that can be caused by a domination relationship towards the natural world, and asking whether there's ways to reinterpret texts or to re-understand them in a more ecological framing.
Could you give some examples? I'm wondering, I think you put Mary Evelyn and John with the retrieval.
Oh, these all go together.
Okay,
So I'm saying.
that's still number one.
That's number one.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm saying that it's a multi-step. It could, all three steps could be applied to one text, or different steps could be applied to different texts as appropriate. So retrieving some texts that we may not know much about, but they have some important ecological messages, that could be a step and that could be sufficient. Or we might need to retrieve that text and reevaluate it or reinterpret it. So this approach is to some degree inspired by feminist theologians who started looking at biblical texts and saying, these are really misogynist and patriarchal, and they really don't work for women who are reading the Bible in the present day. And these feminist theologians would say, okay, that's not okay. We can't look for the original intent. We have to reinterpret these texts in light of modern times and in light of our current understanding of gender relations. So I haven't ever heard Mary Evelyn and John say that they were particularly inspired by that feminist move, but I'm saying there's much in common between those two moves. That is, reading text with a certain lens and not trying to be objective. I don't know, have you ever heard them say that they were?
I haven't at all. And thinking of the 10 volumes, it doesn't have a particularly strong feminist.
No, it doesn't at all.
It doesn't.
It doesn't at all.
It really doesn't.
No.
I know, it's interesting, isn't it? I hadn't actually thought of that.
Yeah. I think more what I'm pointing out is these are sort of parallel tracks, and because my own training involved feminist theology, and so I noticed it, and I noticed that they were doing the same thing with ecological interpretation. And then the other dominant approach is begin anew. Actually, there's a third one too. But this has been mostly associated with Ron Taylor, and he says, you know what, the world religions are not sufficient to the task that they were facing. They don't speak to ecological degradation. They don't have strong ecological messages that are really useful, and they're just outdated, and we just need to begin anew. And so he has, as I said, has reinterpreted nature practices, particularly fly fishing and surfing, as religious practices. Other people have looked at nature religions like spiritualities or religions that find the sacred in nature. People have looked at neo-paganism as sort of a beginning a new religious movement, or other new religious movements, because religious movements are always arising. And so he thinks that we just need to find a new path. And then, now to me, this is not completely persuasive because it's ahistorical. And you can't ever take yourself out of history. Even I may agree that Christianity is fatally flawed. I'm saying I may agree, I may not agree. But even if I did agree with that, it's not going away. It's here. It was here as part of the founding of this country. And we are all steeped in historically Judeo-Christian culture. So even if we don't subscribe to it or practice it or even have that as part of our background, by living in the US, we're part of that culture. And I think it's really important to understand that. Even if we want to totally change it or find many parts of it to be very damaging, I think we cannot neglect history. So I would be a little more persuaded by Ron Taylor's approach if he connected it more with history and then said we're starting anew in these ways. But in my reading of him so far, he does not do that. But I should point out his book, Deep Green Religion, Dark Green Religion, sorry, is very provocative and very interesting and very readable. So. And that's where he spells out his ideas about how we should begin anew and what sort of current practices we can see as religious practices related to the environment.
Elizabeth, what does the dark refer to in that title?
It refers to a few different things. One is it has resonance with deep ecology, dark green. So we have mainstream green practices, and he wants to go, deeper or darker, so to become even more green. That's one aspect. And another aspect is that some of these can have a sort of dark valence, or sort of not negative sort of valence, and that we need to look at both the positive and the negative of these practices.
What do you mean negative valence?
Well, he says that people turn to religion for hope and inspiration and uplift, and he says, but that's not all. And I would agree, but that's not all. That's an incomplete definition of religion. And so he says we need to look at the darker aspects of religion, whether they deal with grief or suffering, or whether I'm trying to think of a concrete example in his book. So he sees, he finds a lot of dark green religion in going to Disney World. And he makes his case pretty strongly. But he also recognizes that the practice of going to Disney World is not necessarily an environmental or sustainable practice. So it has a dark side. Even if that is a dark green religion, it has a dark side in that it's very consumptive of resources and materialistic and so on. So I think that's the negative valence that he's looking at too. But he says, in Disney World you can see all these animal figures and nature figures, and it connects you to nature in that way. Yeah. But like I said, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting and very provocative. It definitely makes you think about this question: what is religion? Because he really tries to expand out the definition. Now, then my critique of that is it becomes so expansive as to be somewhat meaningless. That's what I was concerned with in that book. But it does raise good questions, so it's worth taking a look at. So begin anew. And then the third proposal that White offers is turn to the east, which we already did today. How about that? Thanks, Robert. And this one I'm ambivalent about too. My own affinities absolutely lie in the turn to the east, and at the same time, as I just said, it's a historical and a geographical. I'm an American. I grew up in this culture. Grew up going to church, and I think we really have to recognize that before we flee to it. So sometimes I see the turn to the east as a sort of flight from reality or responsibility. Lily?
Yeah, isn't that another thing that can be sort of like ahistorical, sort of especially?
The turn to the east?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And as a Western person, well, I'm just going to look at that direction and it's nice over
Absolutely.
there and I don't have any baggage.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think
And it becomes cherry picking too. I like this practice, I like this text. But as Robert was saying earlier, this whole idea of the Buddha and the Dharma, you need to take the whole context of the teacher and the teaching, and not just like, I like this verse and, this downward thought. Yeah, this point?
Well, I was actually thinking about psychology before you mentioned them to the East, and then you mentioned them to the East, because the Eastern traditions tend to be more interior, right?
Right.
Focusing on the inner experience. The Buddha, this is not real, this is a dream, right? So I was just a little bit feeling like what you're mentioning here on the board is kind of like exterior ecology. Like for the Taoists, your body is the cosmos. It's a representation of the cosmos. So, and when you move into more of the transpersonal realms, then the very ground of reality is entirely different from, normal psychology. in that
Sure.
sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the role of psychology is certainly relevant in all this, and transpersonal psychology particularly. I would say that much of this, up to maybe here, grows out of the environmental movement, which is a very materialist-based movement and very concerned with exterior ecology. But I think that is one of the edges, is how do transpersonal and I guess trans-being psychologies play into this, and trying to understand the anonymity in these things. Absolutely. Robert, do you have a
I
point?
don't know, I guess I'm trying to, you decide if you want to be drawn out on this
Okay.
subject of the Church of the East. Would you like to be, or do you want to keep going?
Do you have a particular question?
It's more of a topic than a question. I just think it seems like it cuts both ways. That it's,
Totally, yeah.
I mean, I think Thomas Berry probably finished up as a Confucian, Mary Evelyn is deep in Japanese Buddhism, Neo-Confucianism, sorry.
Mhm.
You have a relationship to Buddhism, I have a relationship to Buddhism and Hinduism,
Yeah.
and yet I agree that is a cherry-picking sort of temptation, and can become, anyway, I find it's not clear, it's unresolved, and I just thought if you wanted to say more, it would probably be interesting to hear what you had to say.
I can say a little bit more. It is definitely incomplete and unresolved, because here's a further complication. Much of the environmental movement comes out of a turn to the east. Not much is maybe too strong, but major leaders like Thoreau and Gary Snyder, who lived in the Bay Area, and Peter Matheson were deeply attracted to Eastern mysticism, and Gary Snyder became a Zen priest and spent years in Japan. So did Peter Matheson, and then these are some of the people who are leading writers and thinkers in the environmental movement in the 70s and 60s, 70s, and 80s. So they're influencing how other people think about nature. So, and importing these ideas about nature from their travels. So, yeah, I think it's complicated, and I don't have the full thesis at this point. But wait, there's one more. Who was it? Matheson? Snyder. No, Arnie Nuss. Arnie Nuss, the founder of Deep Ecology, was provoked in his thinking by a journey to Nepal, where he worked with Sherpas, the ethnic group, to carry stuff up the mountain, and he found them incredibly joyful and full of life and engaged with their surroundings, and that really provoked some of his ideas towards deep ecology, and he writes about this. So a lot of our ideas about nature actually have these roots in Asian cultures, and have been twisted and reconfigured to fit into the American culture. Yeah.
Yeah, it just makes me think of Jung was one to keep an arm's length from the East because we're from the West.
Uh-huh.
And he goes to Greek and Christianity, he goes deep, deep into that. It just seems like we're moving to a place where it's global. I mean, it's not only global, it's cosmic. So to bring in the East and the West and just include all of it.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, it's to a place of, I mean, we're all connected, if you have a phone, to every person on the globe instantaneously.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to 250 years ago, people wouldn't even go 10 miles out of their village and there was no communication. Now we're just connected totally, so it just seems like to bring all of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is kind of where spiritual psychology is going, actually, is open to a range of influences to try to better understand the human-nature relationship. That's well put. Yeah.
I want to, did you just mention Jung or?
Carl Jung, my
Yeah,
hero,
actually-
my hero, yes.
Yeah, actually, I'm thinking, I think in the last, I mean, like 10 or 20 years, Jung actually interacted with Richard Wellham, who is a translator of the I Ching book, to turn the first person, and they grew quite close. And actually, some of the inspiration of Jung's drawing of mandalas are from, Eastern philosophy and cultural ideas. And another point I want to make is resonance with Kant's idea is the psychology's association with all this ecology, spirituality movement, because there's a shadow side to it. Like in this time the reading, especially the one article written by the 17th Wang Kamapam. It's hard to name.
Yeah.
Well, one sentence I remember, he said, the reason we do this to protect our environment is to, to elevate or whatever, eliminate the sufferings of all the beings in the world. It's more altruism and has this deep caring nature. But there are people, if you're not careful enough, there are people who are just using the big cause to escape from their own, personal issues. And if you have that motive or intention underneath your behaviors and your conducts, and I do not think gonna generate, benefits or, beneficial things for the whole human being or the planet in the long run.
Absolutely. And so then again, the importance of psychology, right? So I came up with a new personal motto yesterday in conversation with a friend, but I think it's relevant here. Grown-ups take care of themselves. And I think that it goes to and certainly the Buddhism that I'm familiar with emphasizes that if you don't take care of your own ignorance, your own craving, if you don't try to overcome these three poisons, then you can't be of service to the world. But yes, there certainly is sometimes an inclination to try to be of service in order to avoid dealing with the three poisons or whatever inner turmoil one has. Yeah, so that's important. Yeah.
Well, but also because the Eastern traditions are karmic, and karma is not something that the Western mind understands, because it's, this sense that if you do something out there, it's going to come back.
Yeah.
That's so firmly rooted in Buddhism.
Right. So here's my good pen. Karma is exactly what I want to talk about, because that's what I think we are experiencing. But we're going to do that after the break. Good point. Great. Anything else right now? Yeah.
So is this saying, when you use the title Turn to the East, the implication that this is a Western kind of school of thought or orientation? Because I was thinking, well, who does this impact? And as we know, a lot of the first people who get touched by the rising water levels are the people in the so-called East, or like in Bangladesh, for example. And so what does that mean about this approach? Is that implying, or is that an admittance that this is coming from a strong Western standpoint?
Great point. Yes, the last. So this trajectory that I've talked about as far as religion and ecology, and I would say as well as the environmental movement broadly, which I haven't talked about today, are coming out of the US and then to a lesser degree Western Europe and Australia. But really the environmental movement was founded here in the US. And these leading thinkers are in the US. So yes, this is a US centric approach, way of thinking. It is somewhat shared around the world, but it's not a way of thinking that's coming out of the South or the East, and that's a good point. And I'm not sure what is or what would be. I mean, I can tell you from my own research that there's not such a sharp dichotomy between nature and culture, or between humans and nature, or between any of the things that we tend to dichotomize. And my own research was, the big question was, how does religion influence environmental management in Bhutan? And to some people that was nonsensical, because religion influences everything. And in that context, environmental management happens or it doesn't. So I think that had a religion and ecology field developed not in the US, it would have looked different. Does that help?
Yeah, I'm just confused, cause like, for example, if you see the photos for 350.org, Bill McKibben, you know, there is such a strong, I mean, yeah, there's huge rallies over here, but then it's incredible and it's very inspiring to see how many countries out there that we didn't realize, so I'm just wondering, is it an open question still, like, maybe we just haven't looked hard enough to realize that there are these movements elsewhere, but for maybe even political reasons, they haven't gotten as much standing as they have in the West. Like, as Brian's point about, you know, realistically, we are in this new global age, and for this to be to be successful, it has to be a multi-centric.
Oh, for sure. The history that I've told you is a US history, and then it has certainly spread outward and encountered other movements, you know, where it's gone. But even 350.org is a US based movement that has found great resonance with local people in particular places and helped 350.org has helped local people and local people has helped 350.org in this common cause. So I'm not saying that this is not applicable to other cultures or other situations by any means. I'm just trying to point out the historical specificity and be clear about that, because I think that had it arisen elsewhere, it would have taken a very different form. And is now probably starting to take a different form with a broader understanding of spiritual ecology. And I mean, again, I'm talking about US-based scholars. So US-based scholars have a tendency to study the Abrahamic religions, texts, you know, dominant mainstream religions. And but as this field has grown over the past few decades, then it's opened up to more sort of fringy areas, whether it's neo-paganism in the US or the practices of religion and ecology in Bangladesh or in the Pacific atolls or wherever else they might be. And also I would say that local people in those places have been much more insightful spokespeople for religion and ecology in the things that I've read. I mean, because they don't make these Cartesian splits between mind and matter, between spirit and nature, people and nature. And so they just talk about the holism and the interconnection of their lives and their livelihoods and what's sacred to them and what's spiritually important to them. And to me, it's much more powerful than actually some of the academic things that I read that sort of dice it all up into a linear model. So those are some critiques that we can bring to the field too, but I think that the field would have developed to the point that it's developed without taking the mainstream academic approach to sort of codify and establish itself. Does that make sense? That was a good question. Anything? Yes?
Yeah, I had a question about the first type, right? Retrieval, reevaluation, reinterpretation. My question was this, to say that when I think about a religion, it seems to function pretty much as a place where someone has a certain message and then certain people want more of that, and so a followership grows and then institutions are created to house all these people and deal with logistics, right? When you're talking about reevaluation or reinterpretation of a religious text by somebody who might be an academic or maybe have certain kinds of credentials in certain circles, but how does that bridge of legitimacy get crossed when you say, here's a reinterpretation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there has always been this tension in religious studies between the practitioners and the scholars. And when I was an undergrad, you weren't supposed to be a believer. You were supposed to be an objective scholar. And there was even like a sort of a saying or a supposition that if you were a believer, you get kicked out of the religious studies department. So just keeping that in mind as part of the scholarly tradition. I think that you're right that someone who's outside of the tradition comes and says, oh, your text is misogynist, you need to fix it. That's not going to be received very well, right? But there can be a subtler way to point out, here are some teachings that could be damaging to women or could be ecologically damaging. just bringing these to awareness even, this seems to be a message of domination. But similarly, retrieval and reinterpretation scholars have also brought to light the ecological messages inherent in the traditional texts. And so they found, for example, in Islam that there's a practice, harim, of setting aside land. Like each village needs to set aside land and keep it open and not build on it. And historically it was for, if anyone was really impoverished, they would be able to hunt or farm there. And but it looks like a great practice for setting aside open land to protect wildlife. And so interpreters have said, hey, look at this great ecological message that you have. Just kind of bringing it to attention. Wow, that's in your tradition already. You can become aware of it. Maybe you want to emphasize it or let other people know. So it's not just saying, oh, your text is all messed up, you need to change it, but also highlighting, reevaluating and reinterpreting what is already there.
So the legitimacy maybe in this sense comes through the sensitivity through which you're negotiating.
For sure, yeah. And there could be scholars who are part of the tradition, they may be accorded greater legitimacy, but there's also cultural sensitivity, for sure. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking of the whole evolution of Western culture and positive scientific paradigm that has manifested pushing religion out to the point where Nietzsche said God is dead, and we've got to the place where Jung tried to bring religion back in by saying that we have a innate instinct for religion. And that, so this would just be like a continuation of the evolution where, well, our scientific paradigm, we want to use all this knowledge and investigate it and find out and bring back religion in a way that can be, positive and not the negative institution and dogma and destruction that religion had before. So.
Yeah, and it may still have that baggage, and we may not be able to get rid of that, but we could be maybe a bit more aware and critical. But also, yeah, this is very much in response to the secularization hypothesis that religion would disappear with technology and science and rationalization, and it didn't. I mean, if anything, religion has grown, and there are plenty of studies that show the engagement in the US with religions and the engagement around the world with religions. In this most recent book, Tucker and Grimm, I think they say like 90% of the people around the world are engaged with some form of religion. And so then Mary Evelyn Tucker says, why religion? That's where the people are. Like, that's how people are connecting with their communities, with each other, and that's how they're learning moral lessons. And so that's where we have to go. Yeah. One more question, then I think we should take a break.
Yeah. I was wondering how much leverage religion really has on the environment and environmentalism. When isn't it, power, economic power, that is actually doing all work on the environment and it's causing the problems, and ordinary people, religious or not, don't have much or any leverage on that. And isn't that systemic capitalism rather than people's personal opinions?
So this is a question about your theory of change. And I think that your theory of change may be implicit in your question. But that's not the only theory of change. So another theory of change is that changing worldviews or changing ideas changes practices and what follows on. And this, I would say PCC in particular works with that kind of theory of change, that we think if we study and examine and learn about worldviews to the extent that we maybe can change or intervene in them, then that will contribute to some sort of positive future we want to see. And this certainly works also in that realm of looking at what people believe and how that affects their life or their practice or what they express in the world, and whether it's possible to enact change following that. And I think it's both, really. I mean, there are plenty of people that argue that the material foundation of the world is what creates change, and its economic relations and its political relations, and that has been the driver of change, at least since, I don't know, the agricultural revolution. People can argue that. And then there's equally intelligent people who argue that no, it's all ideas. How did you even get the idea to build that machine or create that technology? Ideas come first. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's really both. I mean, I study institutions and politics also, and I think that capitalism is a very big problem. But how do we get the idea to dismantle capitalism? It's an idea first before it becomes a practice, or to change it. So yes, institutions and corporations have the power right now, but people make them. So can we decide to change them?
The first choice was Hegel, the second choice is Marx, and the third is Elizabeth Allison.
Sure. So let's take a break.
Elizabeth goes first.